The numbers show that women are underrepresented in the music industry, and most recording artists and writers are men. There are female artists, such as Cardi B, credited with challenging the gender norms in the business. But some wonder if the images that they present can work against the cause of gender equality as they try to climb to the top of the charts in an industry dominated by men. Carolee McGrath sat down with Whitney Battle Baptiste, an associate professor of anthropology and the director of the W.E.B. DuBois Center at UMass Amherst, to discuss.
This topic is something that I kind of came to in different directions by my own personal listening, and then trying to use that in the classroom as well as a way to talk about gender in popular culture. And it is difficult because when I'm focused specifically on women of African descent, women of color who are in the music industry, I tend to focus on hip hop and contemporary pop music. And it's unfortunate that there are not a lot of variety of the ways in which women are portrayed in music, usually either in the background as kind of filler in videos, or there's specific tropes about either being a strong woman or being hypersexual. And so that's kind of those challenging how that hypersexuality can also be seen as empowering is perfect stuff to bring to the classroom to engage with the students of this generation and try to talk to them about what that means in larger society.
So when you talk about hypersexuality, are artists doing that because they know they're going to get signed or it's going to sell? Because obviously the music industry, for them, they're probably like, yes, people are going to watch if you're doing something provocative. But doesn't the artist compromise herself if you kind of give into that?
I mean, yes, and of course these are really heated discussions that we have in my classes when we talk about this. Is there any way to be hypersexual where it's 100% what you want to do? And we don't actually know what is in the minds of women who do this, but examples, which we talked a lot about this past semester was Cardi B and her looking at her story as kind of a come-up story in terms of her leaving school to become a stripper, and then she used social media as a platform. And then that led to her music. It wasn't the music that started her career, it was Instagram. And is she taking it and turning it on its head? Some would say yes.
How? How is she turning it on its head?
By understanding that her body is a commodity and calling that out and saying that I realize that I should take this elevated role that has been given to me by using my sexuality in a way that has often been seen as negative, and then talking about issues like one of the things that went viral was her talking about the shutdown of the government, the 35 days it was shut down. And she actually had this Instagram moment that was retweeted and senators were responding to it. You know, that's just one small thing, but that was literally a 60-second video in which her fan base, some of might have not engaged in that news story, actually engaged in that news story. And that's just one little example.
You mentioned her body as a commodity. As a woman, and everything that you hear from the women's movement, you don't want your body to be a commodity, right? You want people to, like you for who you are on the inside, your intelligence. Why is, particularly in the music industry, do you have to portray that kind of appearance? Why can't you just sing? So why is that something that makes you powerful? A lot of people might say, geez, women are better than that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I get that argument, but for me, when I teach about hip hop, I talk about also the hyper masculinity of it and the violence of it. Why are Black men portrayed in this very hyper masculine way as being threatening, and why are women being seen as hypersexual, and how is that empowering? How is that not kind of pulling back progress and the ideas of us as individuals, as folks of African descent? The truth is that it becomes not that it's empowering. It's the idea that you are calling out that music industry is a reflection of larger society. And unfortunately, women are still put in these boxes, these small categories that are problematic. And until we begin to address them head on and not just act like women make as much as men, I'm a professor, and I know that in the academy, my work is questioned slightly more than my male colleagues for the quality or the quantity. Now, that has nothing to do with me being hypersexual. It has to do with my genders very specifically. And then if I add race, then there's a whole nother conversation. But I think that it's such a fine line between what is empowering and what is calling or bringing to light what is in society.
Right, but I don't think Cardi B is helping anybody's case as far as gender equality in terms of, being paid, the same. Like that, I don't, people would argue, like, is that really going to help, the cause for women or elevate women in any way?
I think that her path should not, I have to be honest, I don't think that her path should be villainized. I think that there are women who have made a difference within girls that look up to her for whatever reason because of the ways in which they are kind of socialized into society. And to see her continue to call out, and I say, I know it's provocative for me to say her body is a commodity, but she calls that out as a level of, you don't have to do this to get money, but if material wealth is what you want, then understand that your body itself can be commoditized. And that is so problematic, but it's a reflection of larger society.
I think it really does
and at
upset people to hear that.
Right, and it's okay. I mean, I think that part of the reason why celebrities are so prevalent in not all of us, not me, but celebrities are very, very important to the lives of everyday people. We are so attached to materialism and getting more and being famous and using social media as a platform to do that, that we tend to lose sight of what that impacts in our lives and our accomplishments and how does social justice get pushed and promoted by young teenagers and young adults whose sole goal is to have 1 million followers on Instagram or Twitter. I mean, I think that we're in a day and age where there's a complexity of the ways in which folks can find ways to empower themselves. And I don't think Cardi B should be held up as the only way, but I think that is one way. I mean, she has this lovely probably 30-second video on Instagram about what's the meaning of a feminist. And she said that she's not supposed to be a feminist. And part of it is not just because she was a stripper, but part of it is because of where she's from, how she looks, and who she is. Feminism is for other people. And her response to it is, I'm a feminist because I believe in the equality of women. So how can we live as complicated people when we know that she was a stripper, but if you listen to a lot of her songs, she talks about the pain of choosing between school and feeding her family. And so in the same ways that there's sympathy for or admiration for Jay-Z, he didn't start out in a legal way. He started out as I call from where I'm from, street pharmaceuticals, which is he sold drugs. And that's how he eventually filtered into becoming a rap artist. And now he and his wife are very, very wealthy. And the kinds of money and philanthropy and social justice issues that they fund and put money toward are phenomenal. But he didn't start in a way that was traditional, in a way that a lot of people would have problems with.
But I think a lot of people might argue the fact that it's just a shame, because I bet, so many of these musicians, who are out there, performing in different ways, maybe provocative ways, have so much talent. Mm-hmm. But it's like you have to get out there and do that. But last question for you, politics in music. A lot of people might say, hey, listen, I just want to escape. When I turn the radio on, I don't want to care about, who's tweeting what just happened in the news. I just want to drive home from work and just, forget about my day. Why can't entertainers just kind of leave it to the side?
I think there's some that do. And for me, I know that it's so positive to have a variety of music and artists in your life. I know that there's some days where I really want to hear the political rap. I want to hear the rap about, empowerment. I want to hear, the important stuff. And then there's some times that I just want to relax or dance or enjoy. So I think that there's a variety, but I think there's always going to be politics in music, especially in Black music, because if you look back to blues and R&B that actually birthed hip hop, it was telling stories. It was telling the story that wasn't being told in history books or in the collective memory of our country. It was a way of expression, and a lot of that expression is painful, and a lot of that expression is angry, and a lot of that expression is meaningful at certain times in your life when you kind of need that inspiration or information.